When you hear the word anatomy, what comes to mind? Probably some diagrams of a skeleton or the muscular system, lots of big confusing names. Some people are just naturally really good at learning all these names, and other people, it just takes a lot more time and repetition. But anatomy really is about knowing the parts of the body, right? And that can be from a big scale, things like the nervous system and digestive system, down to a really small, fine scale, like the parts of a cell that you've studied already. Let's take an example. The wrist, right? This is the whole thing is the carpal region. That's that area. You probably heard of carpal tunnel syndrome. That comes from the name of the wrist area. Within the wrist, there are many different bones, like the hamate bone and the capitate bone. Those bones are made of osseous tissue or bone tissue. That's held together by ligaments, which is another type of tissue. Some of them are covered by different epithelial tissues, and those tissues are made out of cells. We focused all quarter long on cells, and now we're going to take those cells and put them together into tissues, which will be put together into organs all over the body. So I want to start that journey with epithelial tissue. That's the tissue. We have 4 tissue types, but that's the one that you see. When you look at me, this is all epithelial tissue, even lining the mouth, epithelial tissue. It's the stuff that lines the outside of our body and the inside of our body. It's fairly simple and it's made of lots of cells, so it's a nice place to start your journey into a larger system of anatomy. Now you probably already see that anatomy is closely linked with physiology. The form and the function, they go together.
If you take a bunch of cells and put them together, then you have a tissue. And one of those tissues is epithelial tissue. It's what lines and covers the areas of animal bodies. And there are 3 basic shapes that those cells can take in this tissue. The first one is really flat. And we've talked about membrane exchange, and we will again in a moment. But we just assumed that membrane was around a cell. At least that's the way we've talked about it so far. But then here we have a membrane made of many cells. And if the membrane is thin, then substances can easily pass through that, and it can be used as an exchange tissue. For example, you might find this in the lungs, so that oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse freely across them. If you have a cell that's a little bit larger, this cube-shaped cell, here we see in the top an actual microscope image of it. These are arranged in a tube. They're larger cells, and usually these are involved in secretion. They're producing proteins with all the nucleus and endoplasmic reticulum within them. They export those proteins into this lumen, this hollow tube, which then gets excreted as probably a hormone or a digestive enzyme or something like that. Lastly, we have these really big columnar cells, and these usually line the digestive system. It takes a lot of energy to take all those little particles that are floating around in the digestive system and bring them into the cell and export them out the other side. And so that cell requires quite a bit of energy. And so there's one example of relationship between anatomy and physiology.
I want to illustrate that, but again, going back to the skin, right? The skin covers us and it has certain functions about protecting our bodies. And I would expect that our skin should have a similar function to the skin of other organisms, not only other animals, but even the skin of plants.
So let's just look at a couple things. Let's start with hair. So we have hair covering our skin. It protects us from sunlight, especially on the top of our head, and maybe other organisms that might want to try to get in. And a lot of times leaf surfaces are covered in a thick mat of hair with the same sort of functions. What else? Well, skin protects us from pathogens, and so all this layer of cells, These are actually epithelial cells, but arranged in multiple layers to protect us so the bacteria and other germs can't get through very easily. It's a pretty thick layer and tightly held together. Well, plants have just a one cell thick skin, these blue cells over here, but they're very tightly held together so that it'll be difficult for an organism to squeeze through those and infect the inside of the leaf. One last thing is that our skin is fairly waterproof, and some of that is just because of these cells tightly locked together. Another part of it is the oils on our skin secreted by these sebaceous glands that are going to come out here and cover the surface of our skin and helps to keep us fairly waterproof, keeping the water inside. And plants operate the same way. There's a lot of water inside the leaf here, and this cuticle is what you see in yellow here, this coating on top of the leaf. It's another type of lipid. This is a wax that coats the leaf and keeps water from escaping out those cells. And so similar form, similar function. They certainly don't look exactly the same, but where they do the same job, there are some interesting similarities, even for organisms as different as plant and animal.
So at this point, what I hope you could do is to explain to somebody what anatomy is, that you can explain the different scales at which you can study anatomy, and that you can, thirdly, explain the relationship between anatomy and physiology. If you can do those things, you're in great shape.